Have you ever seen an image of strength? Like this. A picture of power. Like this. A portrait of courage. Like this. Ask yourself these questions, because the answers tell you how superhuman this man really was. Any sport Jim Brown played, he dominated. With a combination of speed, force, and will. But Jim Brown was so much more than arguably the greatest football player of all time.
So as we look at Jim Brown as a football player, specifically in the NFL, even we can look at that and say it's very sort of typical in that year one was not reflective of the player he would be. In the numbers that I'm about to share with you, we're going to just throw out year one, and then we'll circle back to year one. From 1958 until 1965, there was not a single season under 1,450 yards and 11 touchdowns. There was only one season where he scored less than 10 touchdowns, and it was 9. And yet the high water marks are 21, 18, 18, and 14 for touchdowns. If we take those 8 years as opposed to the 9 and just crunch some averages, Jim Brown averaged 1,400 yards and 13 touchdowns every season. Now, the important thing to take from that before we start projecting out and start looking at how does that compare to other all-time running backs, it's important to note that from 1957 to 1960, the NFL teams only played 12 games. From 1961 to 1965, it was 14. So at no point has Jim Brown ever played a 16-game season, and we're looking at 1665, 1519, 1461, 1867, 1513, 2164, 1786, 1872. Those are the combined yards from scrimmage that Jim Brown amassed from 1958 to 1965. Where this gets really interesting is how math affects things. So less games, but similar numbers to, say, somebody playing today. In a 17-game season, somebody getting 14, 15, 16, 1,800 yards is not unheard of. But they get 3 to 5 more games to do so. It's important for when we start talking about the all-time list. As of right now, Jim Brown is 11th on the all-time rushing list with 12,312 yards. The record holder for most rushing yards in a career is Emmitt Smith with about 18,600. If we go on averages, because going on totals wouldn't be fair for anybody involved. So looking at just averages, if we take that 1,421 yards and 13 touchdowns, we break that down into averages, and then multiply out. Jim Brown played 9 seasons. What would happen if he played 15 seasons? If he played 15 seasons, he would still, today, be the leading rusher all time at some number north of 25,000, meaning he would be 7,000 yards ahead of Emmitt Smith. Then, if we take it a little further, bring it back a little bit, what would happen if he had played 13 seasons at that average? He would still be the leading all-time rusher in NFL history if he played 4 more seasons. And if that's not bad enough, if he only played 2 more seasons, he went from 9 to 11. If he had played for only 11 seasons, at the average that he held versus the number of games that they played, Jim Brown would now be 3rd on the all-time rushing list. Now, before we start getting too revisionist history about this, most Hall of Fame players we think of, their production worked on a bell curve. Jerry Rice. Okay? Jerry Rice started out rookie season and put up numbers, right? But those numbers only got better as his seasons progressed. And then eventually he gets to a point and it starts to sort of come back down a little bit. That's why we call it a bell curve, right? Tom Brady, he still had a bell curve. Not as pronounced, but there was still a point at which the bell curve starts to come down. And then he walked away when he was still very, very productive. O.J. Simpson, LaDainian Tomlinson, Walter Payton, all of them had some sense that they retired after experiencing at least some level of decline. So bell curve, right? Jim Brown's production curve goes like this and stops. He literally walked away at the absolute peak of his ability. History being what it is shows us that the vast majority of players have some sort of decline before they retire. Calvin Johnson would be the other very recent example where someone could look at his career and say he still had more years to give. That's absolutely true. The difference, though, is Calvin Johnson had injury issues. Calvin Johnson was getting to a point where he had to ask himself, how much do I still want to be doing this? On top of, the disrespect he felt from the Lions organization. Jim Brown was ascending and then flat out walked away, which brings us to the Art Modell effect. This was back in an era when the coaches in certain scenarios were considered to be more important than most, if not all, of the players. Regrettably, it's why my chosen team decided to name their team after a mortal living man. But it was known that Jim and Paul butted heads a lot.
I was there with Jim and Paul, and boy, they did not get along.
Bobby Mitchell explains how anytime Paul Brown wanted to yell at Jim Brown, which was often, he would yell at Bobby Mitchell.
He needed some way to control him and not ever embarrass him in front of the guys who depended on him so much. Jim would time it when we'd get there just about time the bus should be gone, and Paul Brown would get off the bus. Jim Brown is here, and I'm here, and he'd walk right in my face. He'd get right in my nose. And he said, Bobby Mitchell, who do you think you are? We're getting ready to play a football game, and you're coming down late to get this bus. And Jim Brown is standing like this. Now, Jim know he is talking to him.
And Art Modell, who had taken over the team, had a decision to make. Do you align yourself with the coach, which is what was normally the case, or do you realize how great Jim Brown is and say, no, we're aligning with the player, and we'll find a coach to fit the player? This was absolutely kind of a stroke of genius in hindsight, because most scenarios probably would have favored the coach. Art Modell basically had to choose between Jim Brown and Paul Brown. He chose Jim Brown, rightfully so. This is also what would precipitate Paul Brown deciding to found his own NFL franchise and was petty enough about it to put it in the same state and to take the colors of brown and orange and change them to black and orange to make it as close to the team he left as possible. And that was a big sort of middle finger to the Browns organization, make no mistake about it. So while I don't hold any ill will towards the Bengals at all, there's a percentage of Browns fans who probably don't even like to see the Bengals play. When Paul Brown left, that actually ushered in an entire new era for the Browns, where the coach was now working with Jim Brown to find out what works best. What can we do to maximize his ability to freelance a little bit, which was something that Paul Brown absolutely railed against. But once Paul Brown was out of the picture, it opened the door for a little bit more offensive creativity.
To me, at the time, Paul had gotten a little arrogant. He didn't want to adapt to the new things that were being done. You know, Alex Sherman had some ideas, other coaches had some ideas, and Paul was the leader. Felt I was being hindered at that time. I didn't have the freedom I should have had. I needed Bland because I needed freedom. I needed to be a human being that could play every aspect of the game, throw a pass, catch a pass, and have fun doing it. And Bland gave me all of that.
Which is why if we fast forward to the championship game in 1964, you look up the stats, you go, whoa, they absolutely throttled the Colts, and Jim Brown only put up 130 yards and no touchdowns. Yeah. Because they built a team and an offense that could adapt to the various situations. And we will get into the championship game here in just a moment. But for the remainder of his playing career, Jim Brown was Jim Brown, but Jim Brown didn't have the handcuffs on that he had when Paul Brown was the coach. So these are all good things, and another sort of feather in Art Modell's cap of kind of being ahead of the curve. But as we will find out, it's very hard for me to say anything remotely polite about Art Modell because of not that decision, but two other decisions. As much as that decision to get rid of Paul Brown in favor of Jim Brown was the right decision to make, Art Modell would make two catastrophic decisions that would forever vilify him to us. After a little bit of success and a couple seasons over 1,500 yards and 15 touchdowns, you start to see the picture being painted. And this was an era following the Otto Graham era where most people that watched football knew the Browns, and it wasn't what it is now. I mean, you look around any NFL landscape today, and there are a number of teams people will talk about. Just a few that come off the top of my head. Chiefs, Bills, Eagles, 49ers, Cowboys, Bears, Packers, Jets, Dolphins. At no point, typically, do people think Browns first. And that's a very relatively new concept because up until about mid-1990s, the Browns are very much in the forefront of NFL conversations. But how we got to this point is very much Art Modell's fault. Just to get the Art Modell thing out of the way, just because I don't even like talking about him. He is given credit for removing a very famous coach and siding with the player. That was something that we now see all the time. A season doesn't go well, and they're talking about this with my team currently. If the season doesn't go well, they're not moving on from Deshaun Watson. They're moving on from Stefanski and possibly AB. That concept was kind of new and groundbreaking. Art Modell was also instrumental in the invention of Monday Night Football. And to me and most Browns fans, we could not give a darn about that because it doesn't mean anything to us. Because it's such a small footnote versus the calamity that he created after that. We're going to jump way ahead just so I can mention it, and we'll come right back. 1995. I was 16 years old. You ever seen a 16-year-old cry from hearing a sports update on the radio? Because this one did. Art Modell, and I'll be really short about this. If you guys really, really want me to get into it, we can talk about the move and what it was really about and what it wasn't about and all that jazz. But just to sort of sum it all up, the Indians had gotten a new stadium. The Cavaliers had just gotten their arena that at the time was called the Gund Arena. It would quickly change to the Q later on when ownership switches hands. That was a problem for Art Modell. It was a shot to his ego. Art Modell was incensed of the pro teams in Cleveland that he was not first to get a new stadium. He wasn't even second to get a new stadium, and when it came time to ask about getting city appropriated funding to get a new stadium, the mayor and local government basically said, yeah, we can't just keep building stadiums. You're going to have to wait a little bit. Well, his ego couldn't take that. He would tell you until the day he died that it was a financial decision. It was something he had to make for his family, and that is utter and unapologetic BS. Because once he threatened to move the team, the city did come up with a plan that would significantly make getting a stadium easier. Did he hear that and go, oh, in that case, then we're not going to move? No, he was already out the door. Like, he wanted people to literally drop rose petals in front of his feet. And anytime his Browns were not considered the number one thing in the city, he took it personal. So no, him moving the team in 1995, 96 to Baltimore was absolutely not about money. It was about ego. And we will say F him forever for that. Forever. Come back to 1964. This was an interesting landscape because in 1964, Johnny Unitas was that dude. Cleveland did win one less game than the Colts did. But going into that championship game, it was kind of like name this guarantee, but going the other direction. Everyone said that Broadway Joe couldn't do it. And he flat out guaranteed a victory and then pulled it out. And we all sort of remember that and celebrate that as this great seminal moment when a player just refused to not win. Well, if we go back a ways to 1964, every media person, every newspaper, people would say, yeah, it's Johnny U's game to lose. So in come the sort of AFL vibe Cleveland Browns. They got a solid quarterback, but he's not Johnny U, you know? They had a couple receivers that are nice, but no one was scared of him, even with Jim Brown on that team. I can't fathom that. We would look at this and go, they have probably the greatest offensive weapon the world had ever seen to that point, and we were still going to side with Johnny Unitas just because he's Johnny Unitas. And I don't mean that no one should have been rooting for Unitas and the Colts. I'm sure that was a completely fair angle to take. I'm saying the concept that no one picked Cleveland to win kind of baffles my mind now. But we go into that game, and it was in Cleveland, and the weather was not great. That whole first half was sloppy, to say the least. And you can look it up if you want to. But as I mentioned before, after Paul Brown left, it opened up offensive flexibility. The score is tied, 0-0. There's no score in the first half. They come out in the second half, and as it's told to me, because again, I wasn't alive then, but as it's been told to me, the broadcast itself had basically already crowned the Colts as winners because they believed that from this point, if the weather only gets worse, then it's only going to get worse, and then Johnny Unitas only needs to score once or twice and the game's a wrap. What happened after the third quarter kickoff went down in history. Cleveland came out in that second half and straight up mollywopped Johnny Unitas and the Baltimore Colts. It was not pretty. Now, we're talking about Jim Brown, and Jim Brown, as I mentioned, only had 130 yards and no touchdowns. But Jim Brown was everything Jim Brown had to be in that game to maintain defensive balance so that Frank Ryan, the quarterback of the Browns at the time, could connect with wide receiver Gary Collins for almost 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. The final score of that game was 27-0, and it catapulted Cleveland into this tier of being one of those teams that you do need to be afraid of. Sadly, that wouldn't last for very long, and what we as fans are left with post-Jim Brown era has not been representative of Jim Brown the player. But everyone knew Jim Brown was the best player in the world at that point in time with no signs of slowing down. And then 1965 came along, and we talked about that earlier with the Gale Sayers situation. 1965 was Jim Brown at his absolute peak. 21 touchdowns, 1,800 yards. The guy was nuts. And I do believe that he almost had, so he still had 300 yards in receiving, which for a power back, feature back, which we didn't even use those terms back then, was still crazy. He did have a season where he did have 517 yards through the air. No one talks about the fact that he put up very respectable receiving numbers. But in 1965, Jim Brown was the peak of what we even knew was possible. Keep in mind, we'd not seen a 2,000-yard season yet. Now, we'd seen it combined, But we had not seen a single running back rush for 2,000 yards. But he was pretty darn close. 1872 was the combined number in 1965. Just rushing alone, 1544. That goes back to the Gale Sayers segment we talked about earlier. Gale Sayers is another guy that people like to put over Jim Brown, and why, I have no earthly idea. But 1,544 yards and 21 touchdowns. And when he finished the 1965 season, rest assured there were a fan base inside or outside of Cleveland that obviously believed that Jim Brown would go on and just continue to be at that 1,500 to 1,800 range for the next few years. This brings us to the final bit of Art Modell that I will mention in this video. It was not uncommon for NFL players in the 1950s and the 1960s to have summer jobs. These were not athletes that spent all of the offseason working to be ready for training camp again. These guys would have second jobs. Working other jobs was not atypical. However, Jim Brown in 1965 made $50,000 to play in the 1965 NFL season. That offseason, he was paid $40,000 to shoot the Dirty Dozen. So when other guys were working construction or selling insurance, Jim Brown decided he was going to get into acting. If he was ever to stop playing football, this would give him a better financial career. It would give him a longevity that would not be reliant on his physicality. And it was something that stimulated his mind. So when he was approached to do the Dirty Dozen, he absolutely said yes. And anybody would. Could put yourself in 1965 and read that cast list. That is a loaded cast list. So in the offseason, Jim Brown goes to shoot the Dirty Dozen. As it were, as it happens in Hollywood even today, shooting ran long. So he got word back to one of his teammates that he might be a few days late to training camp. Had that conversation gone differently, and Art Modell said, hey, you are the greatest, most important part of this franchise, and I hear you're going to be late. It's not a problem, but just keep me in the loop. Art Modell made it very clear that Jim Brown was to be in camp on time, ready to go, and that he would be fined $100 for every day he's not there.
So I went to London to do the Dirty Dozen, and we're running late. Jim Brown will be fined so many dollars for every day that he was late.
He took it as a personal affront, and he announced his retirement in England.
They just made a mistake. I would have played one more if Modell had been a little more careful in his statements.
I'd like to have had him for another year or two.
When Art Modell says, listen here, punk, you're going to be here on time, and if you're not, I'm going to fine you every day, to the one man who lays down for no one. Art had to know how that was going to go. What happened was Jim Brown just listened to what he had to say and then said, okay, fine, I'm retired. Jim Brown's NFL retirement announcement, in the clothes he's wearing on set, delivering his retirement speech on set. I mean, that's the resolve of this man that we're talking about. Weighing that scenario and realizing that 6 to 8 months playing for the Cleveland Browns under the NFL Shield pays him $50,000, but acting in a movie for 3 months pays him $40,000. He did some quick math and realized, yeah, I don't need this aggravation. I can retire from football right now and be happy with everything that he's done. League MVP, championship in the bag, already happened. More rushing yards than anyone to that point had ever even thought of. He was literally at the top of his game and just chose to walk away. All because an NFL owner had to throw a hissy fit, which is exactly what it was. But Jim Brown responded to that hissy fit in exactly the way that Jim Brown would expect to react. Said, fine. And he moved on, and that was the end of that. He never looked back. But generally speaking, as a player, Jim Brown was not only the best player, but he was the best player by a massive margin.
I should call him Mr. Yeah, we all should. That's the greatness in the building here tonight. And this was right before the game. Mr. Jim Brown. And you can take that for granted. That is two of the best athletes that we've ever seen, all time.
Okay, so before we look at some highlights, I mentioned we would circle back to year one. Now, I mentioned that year one was not indicative of the player that we would remember. So, in year one, does that mean that they ran running back by committee? Maybe he only had 300, 500 yards? No. He had 942 yards, plus another 55 yards receiving, finishing with 10 combined touchdowns, and would go on to win not only unanimous Rookie of the Year, but would also be the AP's league MVP, ahead of big established names like Y.A. Tittle and the previously mentioned Johnny Unitas. The other low rushing total season, there's another one where he's under 1,000 on the ground. But remember, I also mentioned that there was a season where he caught the ball for 517 yards, plus an additional 5 touchdowns in addition to his rushing totals. That year was 1962. And in 1962, when you combined rushing yards and receiving yards and combined touchdowns, Jim Brown finished 1962 with 1,513 yards and 18 total touchdowns. So even when Jim has what is considered to be a down year by his standards, that still would have been a career year for 99% of the running backs over the course of NFL history. Once again, the gap. We've talked about the how he ran. Speed, power, aggression, change of direction. These are all just concepts, but what do they actually look like? And in just a moment, we are going to take a look at some of those highlights and illustrate what we've been talking about this entire time. But I did want to take a few selections, a little sampling, just to give you an idea of what it looked like, just in case Jim Brown is a myth to you. As we move forward with this highlight section, I do want you to take special note of a few factors. Think of any time you've ever watched the Combine or heard a draft analyst talk about measurables at the Combine. One of the things that they like to refer to is their long speed or their separation speed. And a lot of guys are quick, right? Short bursts. And some guys have long speed. And what Jim Brown had is all of that. He had the quickness to be able to change direction. He had the ability to reverse field. He had the ability to do all of that. But when he hits the hole, it's almost alarming at how fast not only does he get through the line and into the second level, but you'll watch him run a line and he's essentially lapping every level, right? So defensive line, passing them by no problem. Right as he gets into that second level, right when the linebacker should be crashing, he's burning right past them. And even with all of that, DBs should still be able to get an angle on him, and they can't. You see kind of where we're going with this. Jim Brown wasn't just good for the time he played. Jim Brown is all-time good. He's next level. So what I want you to do is take special note of his separation speed. Watch how fast he gets through the line and passes everybody in his way. Sometimes it's a straight line. Sometimes he's bouncing off guys, but there's always an element that he's faster than everybody else. Be aware of his unwillingness to go down. You'll never see him run out of bounds voluntarily. You'll never see him take a slide. You'll never see him slow up to brace for the hit. He is 1,000%, 100% of the time. Also, notice his bend and wiggle. For a guy that's 6'2" and 235 pounds, he should not be able to bend and move around the way that he does. You'll see a few plays where there are roadblocks in his way. And normally a guy just tries to power through, get the yards you can, and go down. You're going to see him bounce off guys, push through guys. You're going to see a lot of things that you just don't see today. And the reason for that is we've never seen a running back since Jim Brown be able to do all the things that Jim Brown does and the way that he does them. And that's the important part. Try to conceptualize just how much better he is than everybody else. And that is why I can easily maintain that even to this day, at least at running back, Jim Brown is without question the greatest running back of all time. Not debatable.
Being on the wrong side of a Jim Brown run could be a painful experience, even for the game's greatest defensive players.
And I put my helmet right into his midsection.
A great football position, and I let him have it as hard as I could.
I don't remember whether I got him or not.
And when I woke up, my helmet was bent all the way over my face mask, and it was turned sideways, and my nose was bleeding.
My nose was bleeding here, and I had that big cut up there.
My tooth was chipped. My mouth is bleeding.
I remember laying on that table, and I took my tongue and I ran it over my teeth, and I thought all my teeth was gone.
I also think that if you look at all of those factors and really kind of absorb what we're about to watch, you're going to see at least the opening or the light at the end of the tunnel, or at least the concept as to why a person like myself can say, with a straight face, Jim Brown is the greatest football player of all time. And again, it all comes back to the gap. He did everything so much measurably better than everyone else that it's hard to deny. We've already heard from some NFL Hall of Famers talking about how hard it was to get him down, just how good he was. And for anyone that wants to say, well, those were car insurance salesmen, no, they weren't. Deacon Jones, Dick Butkus, and Ray Nitschke. Those are three of the most dominant defensive players not named Lawrence Taylor that you've ever heard of. And none of them could take down Jim Brown one-on-one. Most of them would slow their pursuit and wait for their teammates to join so they could gang tackle him. That's something that's never been seen since. Not even a bruiser like Earl Campbell can make that claim. Go in with an open mind. Keep your eyes open for all those factors I just mentioned. And I don't think I'm overselling it to say that when we're done watching these highlights, you should be able to see through the matrix code. This shouldn't be a galloping shock to you. After all we've talked about, once we get to the footage, it should make sense. This is not a hot take. This is years and years of crunching numbers and watching footage, and it's not that crazy. Matter of fact, it's not crazy at all. And what's even more interesting, and we'll get to this after the highlights, not that long ago, NFL Network aired a program they referred to as the NFL 100. And I'm going to show you some footage of that as well. And in the NFL 100, we're talking about names that you know today. And that's important because most of the time when we're talking about Jim Brown, he always gets downgraded because it was so long ago. But when you're listening to people like Rich Eisen and Bill Belichick, and even though I don't like him at all, Chris Collinsworth, talking about Jim Brown in the light in which they do, they even said that if this was the NFL 1, this is still the man we're talking to in Jim Brown. Even Bill Belichick says that Jim Brown's the greatest thing that's ever happened to football. And up until very recently, Bill Belichick was almost the authority on the NFL's history who's not named Sable. Typically, all that is fine and good, but then somebody's going to say, yeah, but this player's better or that player's better. What you're going to see momentarily is that those guys that you think are better than Jim Brown, those guys would tell you to your face that Jim Brown's better. I'm going to show it to you. And the reverence for Jim Brown is all you need to know to kind of nail this thing down. And at least, at bare minimum, accept the possibility that Jim Brown is actually in that conversation of the greatest player of all time, regardless of position. So, in the meantime, enjoy this cut-up, because we may never see all of this ability in one man ever again.